August 9, 1945. Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo. Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe stood frozen before the intelligence map of Manchuria, his hand trembling as he held the decoded message from the Kwantung Army. He had been trained to believe Soviet forces were obsolete, disorganized, poorly led, remnants of a broken military purged by Stalin's paranoia. What the reports streaming in from the Manchurian border described instead, through the smoke of burning Japanese divisions, would shatter every assumption the Imperial Japanese Army had built over 8 years of planning. Soviet tanks weren't advancing in small probing attacks. They were moving in coordinated waves of thousands, supported by artillery barrages that turned fortified positions into moonscapes in minutes. And they weren't stopping. For Lieutenant General Kawabe and the 73 senior staff officers gathered at Imperial General Headquarters between August 9 and August 15, 1945, the collision between expectation and reality began the moment Soviet forces crossed into Manchuria at precisely 12:10 a.m. Among them were 12 generals who had personally authored strategic assessments of Soviet military capabilities, documents that would prove catastrophically wrong within 72 hours. According to declassified records from the Military History Department of the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, preserved in their Ichigaya archives, the Imperial Japanese Army's Intelligence Bureau had maintained consistent assessments of Soviet weakness from 1937 through early 1945. The 600-page classified document titled Soviet Far Eastern Forces, Capabilities Assessment and Defensive Posture Analysis dedicated 93 pages to cataloging perceived Soviet deficiencies in equipment, training, and tactical doctrine. What actually happened caught the entire Japanese command structure completely unprepared. Colonel Takeo Igarashi, senior intelligence officer for Manchurian operations, recorded in his war diary, now preserved at the Yasukuni War Museum in Tokyo, his initial reaction to the invasion reports, August 9, 1945, 0630 hours. Reports from all sectors describe Soviet armor penetrations of 40 to 60 kilometers in the first 6 hours. This is impossible. Our assessments predicted maximum Soviet advance rates of 8 to 10 kilometers per day due to logistical limitations and poor coordination. Either our forward commanders are in panic and exaggerating, or every intelligence estimate we have produced for 8 years has been fundamentally flawed. By noon, I knew it was the latter. The psychological preparation Japanese military leadership had received regarding Soviet capabilities was built on specific, seemingly well-documented intelligence. Analysis papers recovered from the Imperial General Headquarters archives, now catalogued in the Japanese National Diet Library's Constitutional Government Materials Room as Document Series MHQ 1945 Soviet Assessment, included detailed projections of Soviet military performance. According to these assessments, Soviet forces were numerically large but operationally primitive, relying on mass rather than maneuver, leadership decimated by political purges, equipment obsolete compared to German standards. The Kwantung Army's defensive plans, codified in Operation Plan Kanto Kuen, assumed Soviet forces would require weeks to mobilize for offensive operations and would advance cautiously, giving Japanese forces time to execute staged withdrawals to prepared defensive positions. Yet here stood Lieutenant General Kawabe, age 52, chief of the Army General Staff Operations Bureau, watching red arrows on the operations map penetrate deeper into Manchuria with each passing hour, advances that shouldn't have been possible according to 8 years of careful intelligence analysis. The cognitive dissonance wasn't merely uncomfortable. It represented the complete collapse of strategic understanding upon which Japan's entire northern defense strategy had been constructed. Major General Shinji Kusaba, commanding officer of the 5th Army stationed in eastern Manchuria, transmitted his first situation report at 1,400 hours on August 9 in a message later preserved in the Defense Agency War History Office archives. Enemy armor has penetrated our forward positions completely. Not breakthrough, penetration. Our defensive lines simply ceased to exist. I counted over 300 tanks in a single formation moving through the Mudanjiang sector. 300 tanks moving with coordination I have never witnessed in 8 years of combat experience. Soviet artillery preparation lasted 90 minutes and destroyed every fortified position, every communications line, every ammunition depot in the forward security zone. We prepared for an enemy that would fumble and stumble. Instead, we face an enemy that moves like a machine with perfect timing and devastating power. I do not know how to stop this. The revelation of Soviet military capability came in successive waves, each more psychologically destabilizing than the last. According to operational records from the Kwantung Army headquarters in Xinking, modern-day Changchun, preserved in the military archives of the National Institute for Defense Studies, the initial contact reports revealed systematic Soviet advantages that intelligence assessments had dismissed as impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, operations officer who had personally authored multiple intelligence assessments minimizing Soviet capabilities, maintained detailed notes that were later seized by Soviet forces and eventually returned to Japanese archives in 1991. His entry from August 10, 1945 reveals the dawning horror, interviewed survivors from the 135th Infantry Regiment. They describe Soviet combined arms coordination that exceeds anything we have achieved in our own forces. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support moving as a single organism. The artillery preparation was not random bombardment, it was surgical. Every command post, every supply depot, every communications hub destroyed in the first 90 minutes. This level of intelligence and operational planning suggests we have been fighting in complete ignorance of true Soviet capabilities. How did we get this so catastrophically wrong? The statistical evidence of the capability gap emerged quickly. According to post-war analysis conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's Pacific Theater Assessment, compiled from captured Japanese records and preserved in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the numbers told a devastating story. Soviet forces committed to Operation August Storm numbered 1.5 million troops, 5,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, 26,000 artillery pieces, and 3,900 aircraft. Japanese intelligence estimates from June 1945 had predicted Soviet force strength at approximately 400,000 troops with limited armor support and minimal air capability. The actual to estimated ratio revealed an intelligence failure of extraordinary magnitude. Soviet forces were nearly 4 times larger than predicted, their armor strength was more than 10 times Japanese estimates, and their artillery concentration was beyond anything Japanese planners had considered possible. Major General Kusaba's report from August 11 captured the operational reality. The Soviets are not simply attacking. They are executing a strategic operation of stunning complexity. Their initial breakthrough forces punch through our lines, then immediately exploitation forces, fresh tank and mechanized units, pour through the gaps and drive deep into our rear areas. By the time we organize counterattacks against the breakthrough force, the exploitation force has already seized our supply bases, headquarters, and communication centers 100 kilometers behind the front. We are not fighting a battle. We are watching our entire army structure dissolve. The speed of Soviet advances shattered every assumption about logistics and operational tempo. According to situation maps preserved in the War History Office, Soviet forces advanced an average of 50 to 60 kilometers per day across difficult Manchurian terrain for the first 5 days of the operation. Japanese planning documents had assessed maximum Soviet advance rates at 8 to 10 kilometers per day, based on assumptions about limited Soviet logistics and coordination. Colonel Igarashi's diary entry from August 12 reveals the psychological impact. We built our entire defensive strategy on the assumption we would have time to mobilize reserves, time to establish fallback positions, time to request reinforcements from the home islands. The Soviets have given us no time. They move faster than our decision-making cycle. By the time higher headquarters analyzes a situation and issues orders, the situation has changed completely. We are always responding to conditions that no longer exist. By August 14, as Emperor Hirohito prepared to announce Japan's surrender, the scope of the intelligence failure had become undeniable. According to final assessments compiled by Imperial General Headquarters and preserved in the National Diet Library, Soviet forces had achieved in 5 days what Japanese intelligence had assessed would take them weeks or months, if they could achieve it at all. Lieutenant General Kawabe, who had stood frozen before the intelligence map on August 9, wrote in his personal journal on August 14, an entry discovered by his family after his death in 1961 and donated to the Yasukuni Museum. We built our strategy on intelligence that was not merely incomplete, it was comprehensively wrong in every meaningful detail. We told ourselves the Soviets were weak, disorganized, poorly led, technologically backward. We needed to believe this because acknowledging their true strength would have revealed the impossibility of our strategic position. Now, in 5 days, they have destroyed the Kwantung Army so thoroughly that our forces are scattered, leaderless, broken. But the military defeat, devastating as it is, pales beside the intellectual defeat. We were wrong about everything. The revelation had occurred. The comfortable assumptions about Soviet military weakness had been systematically demolished through the crushing reality of operational annihilation. But what would happen when Japanese military leadership confronted the reality that they had catastrophically misunderstood their enemies? And what would this devastating failure reveal about the dangers of intelligence that confirms what leaders wish to believe rather than describing uncomfortable reality? August 15, 1945. Imperial Palace, Tokyo. Lieutenant General Torashiro Kawabe stood among the assembled military leadership as Emperor Hirohito's recorded voice announced Japan's surrender. 7 days after Soviet forces had crossed into Manchuria, the Kwantung Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. But the military defeat was only the beginning. The officers who had built their careers on intelligence assessments now proven catastrophically wrong faced a more personal crisis: how to reconcile their professional judgment with the reality that they had been comprehensively, dangerously mistaken. According to post-surrender interrogation records preserved in the Douglas MacArthur Memorial Archives in Norfolk, Virginia, American intelligence officers conducted extensive debriefings of Japanese military leadership between September 1945 and March 1946. The interrogations revealed a consistent pattern: senior officers struggled not primarily with accepting military defeat, but with understanding how their intelligence apparatus had failed so completely. Colonel Takeo Igarashi, the intelligence officer who had authored multiple assessments minimizing Soviet capabilities, faced his American interrogators on September 23, 1945. The transcript, catalogued as document SCAP INT 0847, captures his psychological state. "You ask how we could be so wrong. I ask myself this question every hour. We had sources, military attaches in Moscow, intelligence from German allies, aerial reconnaissance, signal intercepts. We produced thousands of pages of analysis. Yet everything we concluded was false. The Soviets were not weak. They were not disorganized. They were not technologically backward. How did we construct such elaborate delusions from the information available to us?" The answer emerged gradually through post-war analysis. Japanese intelligence hadn't lacked information, it had systematically filtered information to support predetermined conclusions. According to a comprehensive study conducted by the U.S. Army's Military Intelligence Service in 1947, preserved in the National Archives as Report MIS 452-1947, Japanese intelligence officers had access to multiple sources suggesting Soviet military strength, but consistently dismissed evidence that contradicted their assumptions. Major General Shinji Kusaba, whose Fifth Army had been annihilated in the first 72 hours of the Soviet offensive, provided testimony during his September 1945 debriefing that revealed the institutional bias. When intelligence reports suggested Soviet forces were stronger than we believed, we questioned the sources. When reports confirmed our beliefs about Soviet weakness, we accepted them without scrutiny. I personally dismissed 3 separate reports in 1944 that suggested massive Soviet force buildup in the Far East. I told my staff these reports were exaggerated, possibly Soviet deception. Now I understand, we only believed intelligence that made us comfortable. The deeper revelation came from examining why Japanese leadership needed to believe in Soviet weakness. According to strategic planning documents recovered from Imperial General Headquarters and analyzed in the War Department's official history reports of General MacArthur, Japanese operations in the Southwest Pacific area, Japanese military strategy from 1941 onward had depended fundamentally on Soviet neutrality or weakness. Lieutenant General Otozo Yamada, former commander of the Kwantung Army, explained in a written statement submitted during the International Military Tribunal for the Far East proceedings, if we acknowledged Soviet military strength, our entire strategic position became untenable. We could not fight America, Britain, China, and a powerful Soviet Union simultaneously. Therefore, Soviet weakness became not an intelligence assessment but a strategic necessity. We believed it because we needed to believe it. This was not intelligence failure, it was willful blindness disguised as analysis. The personal consequences for the intelligence officers proved severe. According to records maintained by the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare's Investigation Bureau for Repatriated Soldiers, 17 senior intelligence officers involved in Soviet capability assessments took their own lives between August 1945 and December 1946. The suicide rate among this group was 6 times higher than among combat commanders who had lost battles. Colonel Igarashi survived but never held another government position. In a private letter to his brother dated November 1945, discovered among family papers donated to the National Diet Library in 1989, he wrote, "I told our generals what they wanted to hear about Soviet weakness. I dismissed contradictory evidence as unreliable. I convinced myself I was being analytically rigorous when I was actually confirming comfortable prejudices. The Kwantung Army's destruction is partly my responsibility. I constructed the intelligence foundation for a strategy that sent hundreds of thousands of men to pointless death. How does one live with that knowledge?" But the institutional reckoning proved even more significant. The Allied occupation authorities, led by General Douglas MacArthur's staff, conducted extensive reviews of Japanese military decision-making processes. The findings, published in the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers Government Section report Japanese Military Intelligence, Organizational Structure and Analytical Methods, identified systemic failures that extended beyond individual officers. The report documented how Japanese military culture discouraged dissenting analysis. Intelligence officers who provided assessments contradicting strategic assumptions faced career consequences. Lieutenant Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, despite his role in producing flawed Soviet assessments, testified about institutional pressure. Junior officers learned quickly, reports suggesting problems with current strategy were not welcomed. Officers who consistently provided pessimistic assessments were removed from intelligence positions. The system rewarded those who told commanders what they wanted to hear. The educational impact proved transformative for Japan's post-war defense establishment. According to records from the National Defense Academy established in Yokosuka in 1952, the curriculum devoted extensive study to the 1945 intelligence failure. Every officer candidate studied the Manchurian campaign as a case study in analytical bias and strategic self-deception. Professor Hiroshi Nakamura, who taught military history at the National Defense Academy from 1955 to 1978, gave an oral history interview preserved by the National Institute for Defense Studies in 1980. "We taught the Manchurian campaign not as a story of Soviet military superiority, but as a warning about intelligence that serves institutional needs rather than truth. The lesson wasn't the Soviets were stronger than we thought. The lesson was we constructed comfortable lies and called them intelligence assessments." This became foundational to post-war Japanese defense thinking. Adversary capabilities must be assessed objectively, even when that assessment reveals uncomfortable strategic realities. The statistical legacy told its own story. According to Ministry of Defense records analyzing post-war intelligence practices, the Japanese self-defense forces implemented multiple institutional reforms directly traceable to the 1945 failure. Intelligence analysts were protected from command pressure through organizational separation. Dissenting assessments were formally required in strategic planning. Red team analysis, deliberately arguing against prevailing assumptions, became mandatory for major strategic decisions. By the 1960s, academic studies of the intelligence failure had produced hundreds of articles and dozens of books in Japanese military journals. The consensus analysis, summarized in the 1967 National Defense College publication Strategic Intelligence and Decision-Making, Lessons from August 1945, concluded that the failure stemmed not from lack of information but from institutional inability to accept information that contradicted strategic preferences. The human cost provided the most powerful motivation for reform. The Kwantung Army's defeat resulted in approximately 80,000 Japanese military deaths and over 600,000 taken prisoner by Soviet forces. Many prisoners spent years in Soviet labor camps before repatriation. According to Ministry of Health records, of the 600,000 captured, approximately 60,000 died in captivity, deaths that might have been avoided had Japanese leadership accurately assessed Soviet capabilities and negotiated surrender before the Soviet invasion. Lieutenant General Kawabe, who had stood frozen before the intelligence map on August 9, spent his final years teaching at the War History Office. In a 1960 lecture to Defense Academy students, recorded and preserved in the Academy's archives, he reflected on the failure. "We asked the wrong question in 1945. We asked how strong are the Soviets, when we should have asked why do we need to believe the Soviets are weak? The first question requires honest intelligence analysis. The second question reveals uncomfortable truths about our own strategic position and decision-making process. Intelligence failure is rarely about missing information. It's usually about refusing to accept information that contradicts what we desperately want to believe." The international dimension added another layer of significance. According to declassified CIA reports from the 1950s analyzing Allied intelligence practices, American military planners studied the Japanese failure extensively as the Cold War intensified. The lesson resonated powerfully: adversary assessment driven by strategic preference rather than evidence leads to catastrophic surprise. A 1956 CIA intelligence estimate, declassified in 1999 and preserved in the CIA's Freedom of Information Act electronic reading room as document CIA RDP 78-00915 R000400120010, explicitly referenced the Japanese example. The Imperial Japanese Army convinced itself that Soviet forces were weak because acknowledging Soviet strength would have revealed the impossibility of their strategic position. As we assess Soviet capabilities during the current Cold War, we must guard against similar bias. The desire to believe our adversary is weaker than reality can produce intelligence as dangerously flawed as anything produced by Japanese staff officers in 1945. The transformation reached beyond military institutions. Japanese business leaders, rebuilding the nation's economy in the 1950s and 1960s, applied lessons from the intelligence failure to corporate strategy. The emphasis on objective market analysis, willingness to acknowledge competitive threats, and institutional mechanisms for challenging strategic assumptions, characteristics that became hallmarks of post-war Japanese corporate culture, drew explicitly from military lessons about the dangers of comfortable delusion. By the time Lieutenant General Kawabe died in 1961, the intelligence failure of August 1945 had become a foundational narrative in Japanese strategic culture. It appeared in textbooks, military curricula, corporate training programs, and public discourse as a cautionary tale about the catastrophic consequences of believing what you wish to be true rather than what evidence suggests is actually true. The 73 senior officers who had gathered at Imperial General Headquarters on August 9, 1945, had witnessed not just military defeat but the collapse of an entire framework of understanding. The Soviets hadn't just destroyed the Kwantung Army, they had shattered the comfortable assumptions that allowed Japanese leadership to avoid confronting impossible strategic realities. In the end, the revelation proved more devastating than the military defeat itself. Armies can be rebuilt. Equipment can be replaced. Territories can be reclaimed. But once officers realized they had constructed elaborate intellectual frameworks to avoid acknowledging uncomfortable truths, the damage to institutional credibility and personal integrity proved permanent. The Japanese military had defeated itself through willful blindness long before Soviet tanks crossed the Manchurian border. The invasion merely revealed what honest intelligence assessment would have shown years earlier, that Japan's strategic position was untenable, that its assumptions about adversary capabilities were dangerously wrong, and that intelligence serving institutional preferences rather than truth leads inevitably to catastrophic surprise. Lieutenant General Kawabe's final words to that Defense Academy class in 1960 captured the essential lesson. We learned in August 1945 that the most dangerous enemy is not the one across the battlefield, but the comfortable lies we tell ourselves about that enemy. The Soviets destroyed the Kwantung Army. But we destroyed ourselves by refusing to see reality until reality could no longer be ignored. That lesson, purchased at the cost of 80,000 lives and 600,000 prisoners, became the most enduring legacy of 7 days in August 1945 when Japanese High Command finally understood Soviet power, not through intelligence reports or strategic analysis, but through the devastating clarity of operational annihilation.